Would you go if you could? Back over years long past to a house that stood by gray water on green grass, and the age you are, your folks were then. The kitchen table was level with your chin. If someone gave you the power, would you go home? Would you take, if you could, a single hour or day from the hard to the good? What do you think you'd say? The bedtime book, the birthday cake, your mother's gift, your dad's mistake. If someone gave you the power, would you go home? Would you find, if you could, who might have dropped the ball? Was it blows or words? And who let the first one fall? If you had the chance to get revenge, would you take the sword or make amends? If someone gave you the power, if someone gave you the power, would you go home? Dad never talked about the dust. Understand, this was a man who really knew how to talk. He could talk for weeks. He could talk for weeks, but he never talked about the dust. And I never asked him about it either, but then again, I didn't know anything about it. I didn't learn anything about the Dust Bowl when I was in school, not very much about the Great Depression as a whole. And I grew up here, in this beautiful green place, and the only weather that we ever had to complain about was too much water, you know? In any case, I never asked. And I found out later that there's nothing unusual at all about that kind of selective memory. I hear about that all the time. People say the same thing about their own parents and their grandparents. It's common to hear no story at all. People survive literally unspeakable conditions in wartime, for instance, and then they just never speak of it again. It's understandable. Of course it is. But do you want to grow up not knowing who your parents truly are? I didn't. I certainly didn't. And this is my father that we're talking about here. Anybody who knew him, and there are some of you here in this audience, I can tell. Anyone who knew my father knew that when he got started talking, it took an act of God to shut him up. Of course, I suppose you could look at the Dust Bowl as an act of God. Now, when I was a kid, I heard stories from both of my parents about their lives before my brother and I came along, but they were all happy stories. There was nothing dreadful, nothing awful about any of them. They were just stories about other kids. And so I sort of vaguely understood that at some point in their lives, they must have been children too. I sort of guess I pictured them as just smaller versions of the entities that I had come to know as my parents. And in my father's case, I was absolutely correct. He was pretty much the same childlike guy from year 1 to year 91. Right? So when I heard about his childhood in Oklahoma, and I did know that he'd been in Oklahoma, it was easy for me to picture that child. All I had to do was imagine him smaller and erase the beard, right? Yeah, there he is. That is a guy with limitless imagination. He loved to read, he loved to draw. That is the kid that I could see. Let's start at the beginning. This is the boy who grew up to be my father. He couldn't wait to learn to read. He told me once that he must have been insufferable to his poor teacher when he discovered the ocean of information that is the Merriam-Webster dictionary, and he decided he was going to read it, starting at the very beginning.
Aardvark, a burrowing mammal of southern Africa, having a stocky, hairy body, large ears, a long, tubular snout, and powerful digging claws.
They didn't have the diagnosis of attention deficit disorder in those days. They just said that Dad was terrible at interrupting, which he was, always, and he would get so fascinated with everything he was learning that it...
And there's something called an aardwolf, a mammal native to southern and eastern Africa that resembles the hyena. What's a hyena? Has gray fur with black stripes and feeds mainly on termites and insect larvae. It's a wolf that eats bugs.
Finally, the teacher put my father and the dictionary in the closet. So I guess there must have been a light in there or something. But she managed to get a little bit of peace for a little while. But Alfonso William Eggleston had a very loud voice, even then, and he could always...
Acephalus means you have no head.
The world was a fascinating place for Dad. By the way, that was a trait that stuck with him for his whole life. He lived to be enchanted and swept away, and he continued to read. He memorized countless bits of information that would just pop out at any moment. So when I was a kid, I thought he knew everything. I'd be playing or doing homework and...
Did you know the longest name of a town anywhere in the world is Hanfire Pushwingus Gogero Quindrobo Hantasilio Gogogo?
Huh?
Hanfire Pushwingus Gogero Quindrobo Hantasilio Gogogo. It's a Welsh word which translates roughly as St. Mary's Church in the hollow of the White Hazel near a rapid whirlpool, and the Church of St. Tecilio near the Red Cave.
Oh, Dad, I'm trying to figure out the square root of 14,000.
Yes, but isn't it amazing?
That was his favorite phrase. Now, when I was 12 years old or so, and I was in early smartass training, I decided that I was going to trick him and prove that he didn't know absolutely everything on the planet. I found a beautiful picture and a description of an animal in a book, and the animal was called a snow leopard. It was also called an ounce, which was a perfect opportunity. So I said, Dad, what's an ounce?
It's a unit of measurement.
See, he doesn't know that there's a double meaning.
It's also another name for the snow leopard, a large feline mammal of the highlands of Central Asia, having long, thick, whitish-gray fur with dark markings like those of a leopard.
Oh, fine! There was no point in arguing with him. He didn't lose any of his fascination with obscure little factoids either as he got older. And if anything, it just kind of picked up steam. He worked for the art department of the Boeing company, and one day, one of his coworkers decided he would try to trap him just like I had with that snow leopard thing, and he said...
Hey, Al, you know that KLM Airlines? We can't figure out what the KLM stands for. You have any idea?
Koninklijke Luchtvaart Maatschappij. That's Dutch for Royal Dutch Airlines.
You don't say. Okay.
So I had a nice picture of my father as a kid, right? He was a familiar guy. He was just a smaller, younger version. I hear stories like this one.
Did I ever tell you about Granddad's horses? He had 2 horses named Pomp and Whizzer, and one named Old Don.
Pomp and what?
Whizzer. I'm not telling you how he got his name.
That's okay, you don't have to.
Pomp and Whizzer used to eat windfalls off the apple trees, especially the ones that had fermented, so the horses would get drunk before going to work. Kids and I like to watch them stumbling around the fields. It's a funny thing. I mean, when the driver is sober and the wagon is stumbling around, it kind of gives new meaning to the idea of drunk driving.
What about that other horse? Did he tie one on too?
He was retired. He was too old to work, but Granddad just kept him around till he died of old age. Isn't that amazing? And you didn't see very much of that kind of thing in those days.
No, we don't see it very much these days either. So there were snapshots of his life, of his childhood, that would just come out like that. You know what I mean? So he would talk about taking trips to the closest town, the town of Higgins. It was about 10 miles away across the Texas border.
We used to do the damnedest things for fun. When we'd go to town, we'd say, let's go look a haircut. Then we'd go to the barber shop and watch somebody get their hair cut. Well, they'd trade stories with the barber, and you could hear some really great stories that way.
Well, that could be fun, I guess.
And once, a famous rodeo man came to town. He was going from town to town before he retired, showing everybody this horse that he wanted to sell for $100. That most beautiful horse I'd ever seen, and all the cowboys gathered around, hunkered down in the street looking at that horse. Then they all wandered away. No one could afford $100 for a horse.
That one caught my attention. That seems like such a simple little story, doesn't it? Dad told it over and over again for years. And it was clear that it meant something to him, so I used to try to figure out exactly what it was that was so important about that horse. It wasn't just that $100 was so far beyond anybody's reach in those days, especially those cowboys, but really, it had more to do with the value of the life and the work of those cowboys. So that's why so many of his stories turned into songs, because I would have to try to figure out what they meant, and I would just mull them over sometimes for years until it started to make sense. When the night is nothing but starless dark, a night as black as the devil's own heart, a diamond ring could be lying in the road, right at your feet, and you never would know. And here in the desert where the river used to be, by tall yellow corn and the mulberry trees, far as I see there is nothing but gray, and if anything's growing, there's no one left to say, oh, what do we hope for now? Well, winter to summer's pretty much the same. There is every kind of nothing and not a drop of rain. One day the rodeo man came around, a little bit of color in the gray and the brown. He was dressed up fancy, but nobody cared. Still all the cowboys stood and they stared at the finest horse they ever had seen. She was a breathing jewel and a cowboy's dream. Oh, what do we hope for now? said, me and this mare, we're on one last ride, and I'll leave my rodeo days behind. For $100, said the rodeo man, I would put these reins in a cowboy's hand. Look at her, boys, it's a simple fact. She's gotta be worth maybe 10 times that. But when times get hard, the cowboy knows a nickel comes in and a dollar has to go. Look all you want, but there's nothing to say. So one by one they drifted away. Oh, what do we hope for now? Oh, I guess this really is a one-horse town. Every man walks, only one looks down. When yesterday you had a job and a home, and today everybody's been knocked down low. Every stranger you meet on the road might have once been a king, but you never would know. And here in the desert that once grew wheat, with no one in the fields and no one in the street, I would only give a good damn in the end for a few square meals or one real friend. Oh, what do we hope for now? Go and ask in the courtroom, the jail, or the church, but who can say what a soul is worth? If I live to 100, I will never understand how to put a price on a horse or a man. Oh, what do we hope for now? Well, Dad was always the visual artist. So writing songs has always been my only way of painting a picture. Anyway, we never knew when Dad's stories would come out or what they would be about. He would talk about his mother's cooking. I didn't find out for years that they probably didn't always have enough to eat. He just talked about how great the food tasted. And once in a great while, she'd make ice cream. And I swear I could tell you exactly what that ice cream tasted like on a hot day in Oklahoma, because his description of it was so good. And she used to can green beans and bacon, and it was locally famous, and it tasted so good. Except, didn't they give the whole family botulism one time?
Yeah, they did. Everybody lying on the floor for a whole day. All the neighbors loved those green beans and bacon. People would come from miles around for them. You weren't supposed to be able to put bacon in the can with the beans, but Mom always could. Well, except for that one time.
Yeah, there was that one time. But I had a nice picture of Dad as a kid, It seemed nice. They didn't have much, but he was raised in the country like I was, I thought. And it sounded like fun, because he never talked about the dust. He never talked about it because Dad always liked to concentrate on beautiful things, and remembering the dust always made him feel small and ashamed. So the other hidden part of the story had to do with endless dirt and ugliness and poverty. Well, those things left him with a sense of shame. He started talking when he heard the songs of Woody Guthrie. For a guy like my father, Woody Guthrie was the perfect person to finally level the playing field.
19th day of April, 1935, it struck the worst dust storm that ever filled our sky. You could see that dust cloud coming, it looked so death-like black. And all across our nation, it made its dreadful track. From Oklahoma City to the Arizona line, Dakota and Nebraska to the lazy Rio Grande. It fell across our city like a curtain of death rolled down. We thought it was our judgment, we thought it was our doom.
Woody Guthrie's words were the perfect, shocking cure for the silences in the corners of Dad's past, especially these words.
You think you're different from us, but you're not. We had everything you had. We have a house, a home, a job, a work. And then something hit us, and we lost all that.
Here's how the rest of the story finally broke. I took both of my parents to go see a wonderful stage play. It was called Woody Guthrie's American Song. Those magic words were at the end of the first half, the half that talked about the Dust Bowl. And when Dad heard those words for the first time, he suddenly didn't feel so small anymore. It had never occurred to me that he would feel small to begin with, because he always seemed so much larger than life, whatever the hell that's supposed to mean. But at that moment, I could see it. And so I asked my mother what was wrong with Dad, and she said, well, he was there, you know. Dad, were you really there?
We thought it was a prairie fire. Never seen anything that looked like that before. Sky was clear that day for a change till we saw the dust on the horizon. Edges curling like fire, moving faster than anyone could run. One man picked up his kids and started running. He was crying. He knew there was no chance of outrunning that black fire.
Black Sunday. Dad, you remember Black Sunday?
We ran back to this dugout that was our storm shelter, all 6 kids, Mom and Dad. It was so dark you couldn't see a thing. Dad said, Alma, for God's sake, light the lamps. And she started crying. There were 3 lamps already lit. We couldn't see them.
I'd never seen him like that. The Dad and the other refugees from the Great American Dust Bowl, they saw their self-respect erode just as dramatically as their land had done. And so the very first story I ever heard from him was that day, about the day that came to be known as Black Sunday. It was April 14th, 1935. That's how it looked to a 12-year-old kid. It looked like black fire, and I could see it. Everybody could see it. When he told that story for the first time, he told it to the cast of the show that we'd just seen. And what he was telling them from his own memory was news to me. After that, though, after Woody Guthrie gave my dad his voice back, he told those stories for the rest of his life. He's probably still talking. He could tell a riveting story at the drop of a hat. So suddenly, in the middle of a beautiful sunny day in the Pacific Northwest, a story would come to him, and we would be back in Oklahoma with him, actually tasting that dust.
Mom would pour a glass of milk, and for long, it looked like chocolate milk, all the dirt that had settled on it. You had to try and drink it fast. We used to put the dinner plates on the table upside down, and then when we were ready to dish up the food, we'd turn the plates over. There'd be a ring around the clean space where the plates had been. It was like smoke. It could get in anywhere. I used to try and keep things clean. I had a part of the house that I would try and keep clean. The other kids made fun of me for it. I used to wash my socks every night. They thought that was hilarious.
He would start in the morning, as soon as anybody else was awake, to be an audience for him. So I would wander into the kitchen for my very first cup of coffee, and he would all be ready to talk.
You know, we had to sleep, all 6 kids in one bed, and when we got up, Mom would tell us to take the sheets off the bed and hang them up over the doors and windows to keep some of the dust out of the house.
Good morning, Dad. Wait a minute. What would you do when you needed them for the bed again?
What everybody did. We'd take them down, wash them, and put them back on the bed.
And then one day, the story changed.
As the dust got worse, every Saturday when we went to town, we'd pass a funeral and an auction.
And he burst into tears. Maybe sickness and despair are acts of God too. Dad stopped talking then for a long time. He might have been remembering the dust pneumonia that took so many people's lives. I don't know. It took mostly children. Old people who just didn't have the strength to fight anymore. And once in a while it would take a farmer too, someone who just hadn't given up and kept on working their land while their land was blowing away. So the widow would sell everything she could and pack up everything that she could, along with the kids, and hit the road. When my stepdaughter, Casey, was in high school, she had the most wonderful assignment from one of her teachers. I think everybody should do this. Interview some older person about their life. The older, the better. So she chose my dad, and she asked him about his Dust Bowl years. And he talked to her in a different way than he'd ever talked to me. And he said,
Well, I was born in Michigan in 1923, where my father worked for the Ford Motor Company. He was let go in a mass layoff 5 years later, and we moved to Oklahoma, where his father lived. There was no rain to speak of for the next 7 years where we lived, so I had to describe it to the other kids.
how do you describe rain to other kids who've never seen it?
One kid said, "Is it like being stuck under an open faucet? Wouldn't you drown?" And I said, "No. It's more like a big watering can way up in the air."
So what do you do when you hear a story like that? You have to pass it on, don't you? Now, for a songwriter, for any writer, for a songwriter like me, there really is no choice in the matter. And besides, I had an assignment. I told the stories to Utah Phillips, great storyteller, rabble-rouser, union organizer. He impressed the hell out of me, that guy. And I told him some of my dad's Dust Bowl stories, and he listened very carefully, and then he said, "You realize you have to write about that, don't you? Or I will." You don't argue with Utah Phillips. Hey, Dad, I have something to play for you. Can I?
Sure.
One morning, my mother said, "Take the blankets and sheets from the bed. Just before we cover the doors, soak 'em all down good and wet. Cover the windows too, so the worst of the dust won't get through. They'll dry hard and black, be washed and put back, but there isn't much more we can do." And it wasn't the same in Michigan, though we left there when I was just 5. I tell all the kids of 4, 5, and 6 what they've never seen in their lives. The rain digging holes deep, sings you to sleep, and keeps all the dirt on the ground. I have my own ground to sow, next to the house dug in low. My father said, that's your flower bed, if you can make anything grow. And inside one corner's mine, I mark off the floor with a line. Wipe down the walls as high as I'm tall, and then talk to the kids one more time. Oh, Sam thinks you might end up drowning, and Jane says it could pound you flat like buckets poured down from miles around. I tell him it's nothing like that, just rain coming down soft as a dream, sometimes for hours, drenching the flowers and washing everything clean. Every week, someone else gone. Every week we pass a farm, all their possessions all out for auction on what had once been the lawn, and the dust can ride on a sunbeam. It piggybacks on every breeze. It is lighter than thought, but it crushes our crops and it fills the air that we breathe. Maybe I'll tell my grandkids someday if I get old, how all the kids' eyes opened up real wide at the tall tales I told about rain stand under it as it comes down, with your head tilted up, your eyes squinted shut, tasting the drops on your tongue. I just wanted you to know I was listening.
Oh, you sure were.
My brother and I were raised in the Pacific Northwest. We knew perfectly well what rain was. When I started hearing what Dad's childhood had been like, it made perfect sense that he and my mother had wanted to move to the Pacific Northwest. My mother wanted to live in a meadow. She wanted to live in a meadow. She wanted mountains too, and she wanted trees, and she wanted water. They both wanted water, and they wanted weather that would change. So we moved to a house in a meadow. And out of our front window, we could see Puget Sound, the Olympic Mountain Range, the Olympic Peninsula, right outside of our front window. We moved there from California, of course. Dad's family had moved to California as part of the Great Dust Bowl exodus that happened in the dirty 30s. And my mother had moved there from Iowa, the land of corn and Norwegians like herself. So they met in California, they married there, started their family there, and then we all left there and we moved to Vashon Island. Now there's an odd sort of justice and a strange symmetry in the scene that we set right here. We've got a young couple starting their family in the rain-blurred Pacific Northwest. And then we have the man growing old there, sitting in the kitchen, telling story after story after story about his childhood in the dust.
We would go swimming in the Little Rogue River. Barbara was littlest. She'd go in first and scare off all the cottonmouths, then the rest of us would go in.
You're kidding.
No. She was fearless and we were stupid. Then once, I climbed a big old rotten tree on the bank and got way out on a branch over the river. If that branch had cracked, I might not be here now. And neither would you, for that matter.
Yeah, true. I had the exhausting privilege of sitting at that kitchen table, watching my dad's stories just fly around that table in more and more random patterns, and occasional startling clarity, occasionally grabbing one out of the air just long enough to say, "Would you repeat that, please?"
I spent most of my days in Africa.
You've never been to Africa?
Well, there was a character in the Denver Post Sunday comics named Captain Easy. And he was a daring explorer that was always going off to the darkest jungles and doing impossible things gracefully somehow. And I used to read the comics to the other kids every Sunday, and then when we went out to play, I'd pretend to be Captain Easy or Tarzan.
You know, every once in a while, a phrase will drift by that already has a song attached to it somehow. And this was one of those moments. Dad saying, "I spent most of my days in Africa." I spend my days in Africa. I'm home in time for dinner. Sometimes Spain or India. Africa is better. All you other kids, you only dream of California. I see elephants and lions here in Oklahoma. And if you get all your homework done and you promise not to bug me, when I go to Africa, I might take you with me. Yesterday in Africa, I rescued an explorer. I swung from vines and just in time pulled him from the water. Mom and Dad talk of nothing but this Great Depression. I don't understand it, I just wish I could do something. Back here on the farm, I'm just another dusty scarecrow. But yesterday in Africa, I was someone's hero. You know, you can see Africa from your bedroom window. There's big giraffes by Granddad's ranch, hyenas in the hollow. With a little practice, you can close your eyes to see it. These days, well, you never know just when you're gonna need it. So even when the sky turns black and everyone takes cover, can go to Africa until the storm is over. Now that I am old enough to go out with a rifle, my dad says I am good enough to bring food to the table. I guess this dust must be the only crop we're growing. And it's hard to see the jungle when this dirty wind is blowing. Now that there is nothing left, I guess we'll all be leaving. But we can still have Africa wherever we are going. I spend my days in Africa. As the last verse in that song says, my father's family moved west to California as part of the Great Dust Bowl migration that happened in the dirty 30s. That was when thousands of families blew out of the plains, mostly west toward California, living the story of the grapes of wrath. It might have been hellish. There are accounts of the Dust Bowl exodus that certainly are, but it's at this point in Dad's story that I realized just how eloquent his silences were, because there were still large portions of his past that never came to light even after that window into the Dust Bowl had been opened. Some of the more difficult stories were absent, and so I could only detect them by noticing a smattering of very entertaining tales that sort of surrounded a difficult place. Stories like this one.
The old Model A Ford didn't have much in the way of shock absorbers, so when the ride was especially bumpy, the milk for the baby had turned to butter by the time we stopped the car.
That car stuttered all the way to the West Coast. It was ancient, the roads were bad, they didn't have any money. I have no idea how they kept the car running, and I have no idea how they ate along the way. There's just one kind of entertaining little tale that is usually situated somewhere along that ride, usually toward the end. Although it did shift around sometimes depending on Dad's mood. But this one was about my grandfather. His name was Alfonso. It's a weird name for someone of Irish or Scottish descent. He passed it on to Dad.
We used the Scottish spelling for it.
There's no Scottish spelling for Alfonso. Dad thought it sounded cool, though, so he kept saying it. He always was called Al anyway when he wasn't being called Junior.
Dad went by the middle syllable, and everyone called him Fawn. When he went to Europe to fight back in WW1, his best army buddy had been nicknamed Stucky. And I never found out why, but there it was. That was his name. And family legend has it that he was in France on Christmas Day, 1917, and that the opposing forces stopped fighting each other that day.
That happened a few times, apparently, in World War I. You can hear about the one in 1916. There was one at the very beginning of the war between the Hungarians and the Russians. They would stop fighting each other because they couldn't do it on Christmas Day. And when the Americans were there, apparently it happened again. And during that particular ceasefire in 1917, my grandfather wandered off in search of a French girl and some eggs. Details were always blurry about that part. I always thought that Fawn was a little bit of a ladies' man.
Well, he was separated from his army buddies by the time they started fighting again. I have no idea how he survived, but he didn't see his best friend Stucky until 20 years later when the family stopped for gas somewhere on the way to California.
So the family legend has it. Southern California, you can get used to it, but it's not the paradise that I had expected. It was a gas station, 1936. What kind of miracle comes to a place like this? Oh, we circled around like a couple of sharks, stealing looks as we filled our cars. It took a long time till we both said, Jesus Christ, I thought you were dead. 20 years before, it all happened on Christmas. Back in the war, in the stumps of the Argonne forest, you could call it a hiccup of peace. We thought the war was over, but it was too good to last any more than 24 hours. Just long enough to shake the hand of last night's target, today's young man. There was endless mud on foreign land and light like silver in an angel's hand. I was lost from the rest of the men when the shooting started over again. The second touch of God that day wasn't how in the hell I ever got away. I haven't seen you since. I'm not sure I was ready to see a long dead friend filling up a 34 Chevy. You said every year with a bottle of whiskey the boys get together and we toast your memory. But here you are alive somehow. What are we gonna drink to now? Come over and meet my wife. Don't ask so many questions. How many times in your life does a miracle happen?
Our family was somewhere close to the front of the massive crowds that headed west. There were thousands of Dust Bowl refugees. Nobody wanted to leave their land, of course, but the land had left us, so what choice did we have? And many of the Californians didn't take kindly to this. They may have seen the Okies as a plague of locusts descending on their own fields.
I can't help but think of that as maybe the site of so much devastation. I mean, it's one thing to hear about a distant tragedy, but to see it on the very real face of a hungry child is to feel it on your own face, and that turns people mean.
When we got to the California border, along with so many thousands of others, it was like we were trying to cross the border of another country. The bum blockade was there to meet us.
What's the bum blockade?
It was the police. They called us bums, Okies, things like that. Police and, believe it or not, farmers with pitchforks trying to send the Okies back to where they came from. Dad didn't try to argue with him, though. He just said, "Hey, Junior, look, it's the welcoming committee. Everybody smile and wave at the nice gentleman, why don't you?" So all the kids grinned and waved and shouted, "Hi!"
They let him in. Dad thinks they were embarrassed, and maybe they were, They should have been. The police were acting illegally. They were under the orders of Los Angeles County Police Chief James Davis to set up those blockades, 16 different points along the California border. And they called the Dust Bowl refugees thieves, thugs, troublemakers, radicals. Does that sound familiar? It should. Those words have been used to discredit inconvenient people for time out of mind. And these people were trying to cross a state line in their own country. And yet those blockades stayed in place illegally for months. So they sent the Dust Bowl refugees, many of them away to God knows where, just anywhere but here. A few of them got in, though, like the Eggleston family. And then they got their first sight of an orange grove.
We used to get an orange and a stick of celery on Christmas morning. It was the only time I'd ever seen them. To see hundreds of oranges on trees, they didn't look real. They looked like Christmas trees. And at one, we stopped and all the kids got out, trying to pick them up and stick them in our pockets, filling the skirts and pushing them into each other's faces. Eventually, the farmer came out to yell at us, but I guess the sight of all those happy, hungry kids was too much for him. He just said, "Oh, go ahead, then get out of here."
And that's how our family arrived in California. The times are hard, the crops won't grow. Families starve, the dust storms blow. Pack a few small things and go. Your home is just the devil you know. Some turned tails, some dug in, just a few would stay. Most of us, we went gray and thin and we finally blew away. We were rolling west on a gust of wind when the gold rush came again. Heaven can be found, they'd say, turning California way. 1,000 miles, give or take, brings you to the pearly gates. Out of Oklahoma back in 1935, the folks flew like a swarm of bees from a burning hive, and they were hell-bent for the promised land when the gold rush came again. Land of plenty, here we come. I pray there's room for everyone. But if lots of nothing is all you have, lots of folks will turn you back. Lines of angry farmers, they were hard as any stone, and they blocked the California line to send the Okies home. Those of us who made it in, we brought the gold rush on again. Say goodbye to no man's land. Long dark road is at an end. So feast your eyes on the orange groves, Christmas trees in long straight rows. Other folks said there was yellow gold paving The first time we saw it, it was hanging from the trees, and how it seemed like Eden then, when the gold rush came again. And that right there, that's where the trail goes cold. I know so little of what happened to them once they reached the coastal Garden of Eden. I have a few pictures of a handsome young man getting ready to go into the army in World War II. A few pictures of him as a little boy, too, but those didn't show up until after he was gone. Apparently, there were a bunch of photos that were stuck in a little box in a drawer far away from all of our other family photos that I never saw until after he was gone. I'm starting to get to know my cousins on that side, too, and only after his death. So I'm delighted to get to know them finally, and happy to be sharing stories with them and photos. Some of those are left, but we all wonder what happened and what else happened to take all of those voices away. So after the pictures of my young father getting ready to go into the army, there's a gap of a few years before the pictures of my young parents start to show up. Yep. Dad had reinvented himself in the meantime. He had ditched his Oklahoma accent. He had gone to college. He'd gone to Wichita University on the GI Bill. He studied art and architecture, and he met Ruth Nesset, my beautiful Norwegian school teacher mother. And then they got married almost immediately, apparently. I don't know what happened there either. They never were very clear about that. But they worked on the Gumby show together, by the way. Dad was the art director for the Gumby show for the first 44 episodes. He invented a lot of the techniques for claymation. He invented the character of Gumby's sidekick, Pokey. I see some of you didn't know that. And my mother was the first voice of Gumby. My brother and I were raised by Gumby and Pokey. Explains a lot about us, really, if you think about it. Now then, when I was a toddler, we moved up north to the rain and the green, and Dad never talked about the dust, but it was there all the same. And so the apple tree, the pear tree, the garden, the roses, the grass, all had their roots in it, just like we did. So the years went by and we all grew, and for years, the voices stayed silent.
It covered up our fences, it covered up our barn, covered up the tractors, its great mysterious storm. So we loaded our jalopies and we piled the families in and rattled down that highway, never to come